2020 has been another big year for PC performance enthusiasts, with more cores and more speed for less cash. It is a great time to buy a new processor, but there are some big shakeups looming on the horizon. Welcome to Upskilled, our explainer show, where we mostly just seem to break down why AMD is good now. This is a special year-end episode, and I wanted to look back over the year in CPUs. The biggest news of 2020 for PCs was probably Zen 3. AMD launched the next generation of its desktop processors this fall, and actually managed to follow through on a promised 20% improvement in performance without increasing power requirements or moving to an improved manufacturing process. Compared to just a few years ago, AMD is still delivering pretty incredible performance per dollar, and has helped push 6 and 8 core chips into the mainstream. We took a closer look at their flagship 16 core chip, the 5950X, and were blown away by how fast it was for media and content creation work, though it is definitely overkill for most people. On the mobile front, 2020 also saw the release of AMD's Ryzen 4000 series laptop chips. As popular as Zen has been for desktop CPUs, that market is a fraction of the size of the laptop world, and up until these Ryzen 4000 chips, AMD didn't really have a good challenge to Intel's speedy laptop CPUs. We like to focus on the top-end desktop chips, but come on, most folks actually buy laptops. With chips like the 4800 and 4900HS, AMD was able to bring enough power for some serious workloads like video editing to a mid-size laptop. Seriously, the 4900HS scores about as well as Intel's desktop i9-9700K in some benchmarks, and beats AMD's 2018 flagship, the 2700X, by a wide margin. Side note, if you are looking for a laptop, our editor Devindra tested out and was pretty impressed by the Ryzen 4000 powered Asus Rog Zephyrus G14. While the Ryzen 4000 and 5000 series chips are hugely impressive, I do feel like I'm starting to see some online grumbling. With Intel continuing to price its processors maybe a bit higher than I would, and not really offering a compelling performance advantage, AMD's prices have started to rise. Last year's 3800X launched at $400, but this year's equivalent 5800X is $450. And heck, going back 2 years to that 2700X, that was only $330. Is the 5800X better and faster? Absolutely, but either way, we are seeing AMD's prices drift higher. Now, we may see cheaper releases in 2021, and these new chips really are much faster, but for a lot of fans who flocked to AMD as a cheaper but still really fast alternative to Intel, it is a little hard to stomach. What we really need is some more competition. So it would have been great if 2020 was the year that Intel came roaring back with a slate of killer high-performance processors, ones so good that AMD would have to slash prices in order to keep up with them. But 2020 was not the year for that. This past spring saw the release of Intel's 10th gen Comet Lake desktop processors with the flagship 10-core i9-10900K. We tested out some of these chips, and they're fine. Honestly, they're really fine, but all of them are maybe a little bit too expensive for the performance you get. Comet Lake is the maybe fifth iteration of Intel's 14nm process? I'm not sure, I have completely lost track because they stopped adding pluses after 14+++, so who can say? When we tested the 10900K, it was plenty fast, but it ran super hot and sucked down more than 200 watts of power. Intel's in a bit of a rough spot here. Their long-awaited 10nm manufacturing process, which promises better performance and less power usage, still seems to be barely off the ground. So they're stuck just adding more cores to the same tweaked design we've seen for half a decade now. The reality is, at most of the higher end, there is an AMD chip that probably runs a little bit faster, uses less power, and again, this still kind of blows my mind, probably costs less than a lot of Intel's competing products. Things did get a lot more interesting at the low end, though. With these 10th gen processors, Intel is finally offering hyper-threading, essentially processor multitasking, all the way down to its cheapest CPUs. You can get an i3-10300 chip that's about the equivalent of their flagship i7-6700K from a few years ago for just $175. And as we found in our testing, paired with a decent GPU, that is still plenty fast for most gaming. Still, while the cheapest new AMD chip is $300, if you're willing to just step back a generation, the Ryzen 3 3100 is a $185 processor that offers slightly better multi-core performance at the expense of slightly worse single-core, compared to the i3 10300 for just a few bucks more. One thing holding Intel back is they still haven't given us native desktop support for PCI Express 4.0. This is the high-speed interface used by add-in cards like GPUs, and more importantly, for super-fast NVMe-based solid-state drives. While modern graphics cards aren't really fast enough to take advantage of PCIe 4.0 yet, there are plenty of solid-state drives showing up that have read and write speeds over 5 gigabytes a second. Remember when the 400 megabytes or so of the first flash drives felt super speedy? PCI Express 4.0 is expected on Intel's next chips called Rocket Lake. Confusingly, Intel's 10th generation chips on mobile are entirely different. While they actually premiered in 2019, this year finally saw the wide release of chips based on their Ice Lake design, like the i7 1065 G7, which is made with that long-awaited 10nm process. And they're fine. Again, they're kind of just fine. They're pretty efficient, and the integrated Iris Pro GPU is a big leap forward for Intel's graphics capabilities, but they're kind of held back by slow clock speeds, and so far the 10nm chips just haven't really made a splash. We also saw the release of the first chips for Intel's follow-up to Ice Lake, Tiger Lake, which is built on an improved 10nm process and features a redesigned core architecture. Tiger Lake, or 11th gen chips, are starting to show up in new laptops like the Dell Inspiron and XPS 13, but so far we've only been able to test the higher-end i7 1185 G7 in a prototype machine. And again, who is coming up with these names? Tiger Lake bumps up cache sizes and does bring some improvements in clock speeds, but the biggest changes are in Intel's integrated GPU. Tiger Lake features Intel's brand new redesigned Xe graphics architecture, and we found it was good enough to get around 50 or 60 frames per second at 1080 resolution in medium settings in Overwatch, which is not bad for an integrated GPU. These chips should offer some boosts in performance for the ultra-portable segment, but for serious workloads like rendering and video editing, with only 4 cores, these Tiger Lake chips seem to be struggling to keep up with AMD's 4000 series chips, which have been out for a year and were actually based on even older Zen 2 technology. Intel did also launch its new Lakefield chips based on its Zephyrus design, which takes the various chip components and stacks them vertically. Designed for low-power devices like tablets and ultra-portables, the first Lakefield devices we've seen are actually pretty impressive, delivering decent performance while only sipping a few watts of power. In our editor Sherlin's recent testing, the Lakefield-powered ThinkPad Fold X1 actually bested an iPad Pro in a video playback battery life test. The Lakefield design, with its vertically stacked chips and a smartphone-esque mix of high-end low-power cores, is actually a pretty big deal. Intel has essentially taken a chiplet manufactured at 10 nanometers and containing 5 processor cores, the graphics and other logic, and glued it on top of a 22 nanometer chiplet containing things like the USB and storage controllers. This is akin to AMD's use of a 7 nanometer processor chiplet and a 14 nanometer input-output chiplet, but it's new from Intel, and the vertical stacking design is unique. Lakefield has some big potential advantages in areas like power consumption and memory access, and though the current chips max out at a mere 7 watts of power, it may give us a clue for what Intel has planned in the future. So what do we have to look forward to in 2021? Well, it may actually be a pretty quiet year for AMD. The current crazy unsourced rumors are that they're pretty happy with their position in the market at the moment, and they are going to take their time with Zen 4, so we may not see a major release from them until 2022. 2021 will likely bring a refresh of Zen 3, sort of like they did with the older 3800 XT chips, essentially the same processor at higher clock speeds, and we may see some more processor options, including lower-end ones like a 5300 or equivalent. We may also see an update to AMD's laptop chips. Remember, those Ryzen 4000 series are actually based on what is now pretty old technology, but that may be about it. When Zen 4 does arrive, it may be a bigger change. We know for sure it'll be moving to an improved 5nm manufacturing process, and said crazy rumors suggest that AMD is trying to support super fast DDR5 memory, along with a rework of that input-output die, which hasn't really changed in a few years, and an overhaul of the Infinity Fabric, which is the connection that links all the different parts of the processor together. This increase in speeds, along with a massive Navi-esque L4 cache, a design borrowed from their new graphics cards, could lead to a big improvement in that all-important instructions per clock metric, which is building on some of the advances we actually saw in this year's Zen 3. But again, crazy rumors. Zen 4 will also move to a new motherboard socket. Now, AMD has actually done a pretty good job supporting older motherboards, though some folks may never get support for this year's Zen 3 chips. But they've been using the AM4 socket since 2016. By contrast, Intel seems to require a new motherboard every single year. AM4 has had some inherent limitations, including a fragile pin design that some folks dislike, and a power cap of 142 watts. Moving away from that could change a lot of things, namely higher powered processors and maybe improved I/O options for connecting up all that super fast PCIe 4.0 storage. We're also getting more info about Rocket Lake, Intel's next desktop chips, which take the improved core design from Tiger Lake on mobile and backports it to some sort of 14nm quintuple plus process. Rocket Lake should finally add support for PCI Express 4.0, but it seems like it'll max out at 8 cores, which means that unless those cores come with a serious improvement in performance or speed, it's going to face some stiff competition. At this point, it seems like we won't see a high-performance 10nm desktop chip from Intel until 2022, when their Alder Lake platform is set to launch, which should feature an entirely redesigned architecture, along with maybe a mobile-esque mix of high and low-powered cores. Of course, the shadow looming over all of this is Apple. Their new homegrown M1 chips are seriously fast, and what we've seen so far is essentially just an iPad Pro chip in a fancier package. Our review by our editor Devindra found that the M1 powered MacBook Air actually bested that Zephyrus G14 in single-core performance in Geekbench, though there's a reason to not entirely trust benchmarks comparing the M1 chips to other processors. Stay tuned for our episode on the M1, it's coming up next, and we're gonna dig into it. To achieve these speeds, along with great battery life, the M1 pairs 4 high-powered and 4 low-powered cores. Are you seeing a trend here? But Bloomberg, who got the scoop on the M1 in the first place, says Apple is planning to release computers with 12 or even 16 high-performance cores as soon as spring 2021. Bloomberg in fact reports that Apple is even trialing a 32-core version of the M1 for a refreshed Mac Pro that may be released in the fall. Pair these chips with a 32, 64, or even 128-core GPU, up from just 8 in the current M1s, and you've got what has the potential to be the fastest chip you can get, hands down. There also may be contenders from the world of RISC-V. As we mentioned in our video on that topic, this open source chip design is finally entering the mainstream. Chip designer Sci5 just announced the Hi5 Unmatched, a 5-core Linux-compatible system based on RISC-V. While these early chips are unlikely to be performance champs, Micromagic just announced they managed to get a RISC-V design to run at 5 GHz of speed on just a single watt of power. This is still early days, but that's potentially as much as 13 times as efficient as even the M1. And another of their designs might be as much as 10,000 times as efficient per watt. So RISC-V definitely has some potential. 2020 was another great year for processors. It really feels like 8 cores has become the high-performance standard, maybe helped along a bit by the new consoles, but we've never had so many great options to choose from, all the way down to solid choices for 4-core chips under $200, up to 16-core processors and beyond. And while I wouldn't expect any huge new releases from Intel or AMD in 2021, we really are entering a new era of computing, with Apple and a host of startups looking like they are poised to release some truly revolutionary chips. And we'll be here testing them all out and trying to figure out how the heck they all work. So thank you again for watching, be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the new year.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Engadget's live coverage of CES 2021. I'm senior editor Devindra Hardawar, and I'm joined by our video producer, Chris Schodt. Hey, Chris, how's it going?
Not bad. Thanks for having me here, Dev.
Yeah. I mean, this is all you, Chris. Like, we just saw your upscaled segment about the state of chips today, and we are now gearing up for AMD's CES press conference, which starts at 11 a.m. Eastern. I'm really excited about that. Where do you think Intel and AMD sit now, since since you did that upscaled episode? Because we got a couple Intel tidbits yesterday, right? We heard about the new H series chips. We got some previews of Alder Lake. How do you feel about Intel and AMD at this point?
So the position hasn't changed a lot, but I
Hmm.
do think a couple of the criticisms I had with Intel in that piece, especially that we just weren't seeing many of their 11th gen chips in the market yet, despite
Yeah,
announcements. It
yeah.
looks like they're working hard to rectify that. And some of those actually do bring pretty impressive performance gains. This is one of the biggest architecture changes I feel like we've as I've complained about maybe endlessly in my pieces. Uh, we've seen a lot of iterations of the Skylake architecture, which was really successful, but came out quite a while ago. And there's been a
Yeah.
big string of, I mean, at this point, it's hard to, you'd be hard pressed to look at the most recent chips in that line and say they were directly related to Skylake that came before it. But it's been a series of incremental changes year by year. And these are much bigger redesigns from the ground up,
Hmm.
really targeting a lot of kind of the bottlenecks in modern computing with cache performance and things like that. And they actually seem pretty impressive. I don't know if it's enough to dethrone AMD as the current, performance champs, but
Yeah.
Intel, they've really, especially those low-powered chips, I'm pretty impressed by what they're at least saying they can do.
How do you feel about the new Intel H series chips? So yesterday they announced that the first batch are actually aimed at basically ultra portable gaming notebooks, right? So, and they top out at 4 cores, which doesn't feel like an H series chip to me, but they say the single threaded performance is better than last year's highest end H series notebook chip. So I guess they're really
Yeah.
focusing on single threaded. How do you feel about that and that category of ultra portable gaming laptops under 4 pounds?
So it's not a product I would buy, but but I can actually see there might
Yeah.
be people who would. I guess for
Yeah,
me,
definitely. Yeah.
most of my machines, I want to make sure I can do some productivity work on, and there the 4 cores feels like maybe it's not quite enough. But if you really do want a machine to play some Fortnite and maybe Apex Legends and maybe even Warzone, a game that's a little more graphics intensive,
Yeah.
you really don't need a particularly intense processor, and single thread performance does tend to be kind of the limiting factor. So it's an odd thing, in my opinion, to target, but there very well might be a market for it, and they could deliver some of what they're claiming is their goal with these processors. It just feels like it's very niche to me when I still want my
Yeah.
machines
Yeah.
to be a little more general purpose, I guess.
It's very specific, right? And it's also like Intel's talking about ultra portable gaming notebooks. Like, this is a brand new thing, except last year AMD kind of made those reality with the Ryzen 4000 chips, right? You talked about the Zephyrus G14, my favorite gaming laptop of last year. That thing weighed 3.5 pounds, and it had an 8 core Ryzen chip. It had RTX 2060 graphics. That thing was just like a powerhouse, and that was just so portable. I'm kind of wondering
I know
if
you
Intel is
edited.
still lagging behind that. Yeah.
I do feel like they are a little better. You edited, or you,
Mhm.
sorry, you reviewed that computer. I edited the review, so I got to
Yeah.
see
Yeah.
pretty closely your testing on it and everything. And I feel like that was the computer that kept coming up over and over
Yep.
again throughout the year, essentially, of like, you're checking out a new laptop, this Asus Zephyrus ROG G14. That is a heck of a name, but
Yeah.
uh, it's surprisingly good performance. I even recommended it to a friend's mom, which is that's not really a target market, but they wanted a computer that could do some higher performance things. Like, they wanted to do some pretty
Yeah.
intense Photoshop and image manipulation stuff. And I was like, well, for the price,
Sure.
and you're not going to be carrying it around out of the house a lot, maybe get this gaming laptop.
Right.
Which,
The only downside was that there was no webcam, right? So that felt like the big caveat for a lot of people last year. Maybe this year things will change because we're expecting whole new machines from Asus and everybody. What are you expecting for AMD, right? Because I think the expectation is Ryzen 5000 mobile chips, right? And what does
yeah.
AMD really need to do to improve on last year? Because 4000 seemed really good. It just seemed like it took a while for us to actually see it in machines.
Yeah, so that was the big issue. As I mentioned in that video, the 4000
Mhm.
series is based on chip tech that at this point is a little old. It was kind of a generation behind, and now the
Mhm.
desktop generation has even moved forward again. We had this Zen 3 just launch in the fall, and kind of the big key selling point of the Zen 3 processors was this incredible performance or instruction per clock rate,
Right.
essentially, like how much work it's doing on each cycle. And if they can just bring that improvement down to the mobile chips, there'll be a really big leap forward over last year's processors. They don't actually have to really reinvent the wheel. They just have to take what they've already done on the desktop and repeat the success of the 4000 series, where, it's pretty reasonable to expect the 5000 will bring about a 20% boost in performance without taking more power or needing a ton more cores. So AMD's pretty set up to deliver some potentially pretty impressive laptop chips themselves. I would kind of be shocked if they don't, actually.
Yeah, it's probably last year and this year great times to buy a laptop. Just talking about Intel here, we were talking about the H series chips, right? So what they're doing is they're producing these kind of lower powered H series chips first, and then the high end, the 8 core chips are going to be coming at the end of this first quarter. So I guess that's what's going to be in like the follow up to a lot of the gaming machines from last year. Intel also talked about their upcoming Rocket Lake S chip, right? That's going to be the 11900K. There was some surprising stuff there, right? Because they're actually going back to 8 cores, whereas last year's super popular just spec popping chip, the 10900K, was 10 cores, got up to like 5.3 gigahertz. Like, is this a step back for Intel, you think, or is the focus on better single threaded performance kind of better, for more people?
So it's tricky. It's a little bit of both. I have to
Mhm.
imagine in an ideal world, Intel wouldn't be building these
Yeah.
back on a 14 nanometer process. Their laptop chips have almost all moved to 10 nanometer. As we know, the smaller your transistors, generally, huge generalizations, but the less power it takes to run them. And I just have to imagine if they could have chosen, they wouldn't pick to be building these on a 14 nanometer process. But that said, they've been using that manufacturing for a long time. They are very good at it, and they're very good at getting high clock speeds out of it. I do think stepping back to 8 cores is a little odd, but at least the early leaks and rumors and stuff we've seen suggest that not only do these chips run fast enough that the 8 core chip is probably faster than last year's 10 core, but that also, even with 8 cores, it probably still draws upwards of 250 watts of power, and they might not be able to put 2 more cores on there. They may be running into a heat and power limit.
Yeah.
This is still, these Rocket Lakes are adopting this improved new mobile design I've been talking about. It's the kind of on desktop, the first big break from that chain of Skylake derived chips. So they are going to be working slightly differently. I mean, I don't disbelieve at least the rumors and suggestions that their single core performance really is taking a big jump forward, and that is going to make them faster than their 10 core competitors from last year. The big question is, are they faster than AMD's 12 and 16 core chips? And I'm not, we got to test. Not sure yet.
That's going to be hard to tell too. And how do you feel like, I don't know if you've gotten a chance to do your testing of the ARM chips at this point, or the M1. I feel like Apple just took a lot of wind out of the sails of both Intel and AMD with that chip, because I was testing the MacBook Air, and this thing was just clocking insane numbers. How do you feel that kind of changed the landscape?
So last week I spent 3 afternoons on the phone with experts where I essentially just asked the same question of how the heck did Apple build this over and over again? You did our official review of these products. I'm trying to dig into the architecture side, but what was your impression as you were actually testing these?
I mean, they just feel astoundingly fast. I think I can't remember the last time I felt like just such a huge generational leap in chip performance, right? With the MacBook Air, the instant you open it up, it's on, you ask it to do anything, it is like there. I ran Geekbench, I ran a couple things. It just blew through what we expected from desktop chips. And I think that just kind of shattered my worldview a little, right? Because we normally think of mobile chips and ARM chips as these sort of like, oh, that's cute. You're doing a decent amount of performance. Oh, you're trying to pretend to be a desktop or something. But I think Apple kind of fundamentally showed that no, actually, mobile chips and the efficiency and power you could get from a mobile chip can actually now compete with desktops and actually, basically do even better. I'm thinking of like when Apple announced the M1, right? They showed off some charts that showed the progression of the speeds of every generation of their machines and or of their chips, and basically you could see the intersection point where the A14 started to be faster than the stuff we were seeing from Intel. And I think that's when you realize last year Apple really had to make a choice, right? Are they going to sit back and wait for Intel to kind of up its game a little, or are they going to just like rely on their own tech that they've been building for mobile devices for so long and basically chart their own path into the future? And it seems like that was Apple's decision. I feel like that just shows a huge failure on Intel's part, right? Like not only are they delaying 7 nanometer, they can't even keep their key partner on board because they're so slow with their designs.
Yeah, I mean, my big takeaway was my personal laptop is a 16-inch MacBook Pro with an 8-core i9, and that was my main computer that I benchmarked against the 13-inch MacBook Pro with the M1. In Geekbench, it is hugely faster in single core, though as I'm trying to dig into my episode, that's not actually the best metric. But in multi-core, it was still a point or two faster. This is it's an 8-core chip, but it's 4 high-powered and 4 low-powered cores. And actually, the real, get rid of Geekbench, get rid of the synthetics. I also just installed Premiere Pro on the darn thing and exported a 5 gig chunk of 4K footage, actually from one of our Xbox reviews that I've been using as kind of a standard test clip. My 8-core Intel i9 could reprocess that clip in just about 2 minutes, which is pretty darn fast. And even running through Intel emulation, the M1 did it in about a minute flat.
It's ridiculous. Yeah.
So twice as fast on a chip that doesn't have a fan. It's so low power. I don't get how
Yeah. It's like magic. It is sort of like even Apple emulating Intel is still faster than Intel. Just imagine like when that app is native, it's ridiculous. Yeah.
Bizarre. Yeah, and I haven't run that test on my 16-core AMD desktop yet, but I'm going to. But I'm fairly certain the last time I actually ran that clip, it took about 1:20, which is just unbelievable. Really, I was calling all these experts, and every question I was just like, how? How did they do this? So we're trying to figure it out, but I'm
that's
impressed.
Impressive. Yeah. One thing I want to ask as we're kind of winding down, we're only a couple of minutes away from the AMD keynote. Intel did preview what is coming next for them. So that's going to be 12th gen, I guess, Alder Lake. What do you think about this design? Because now they're getting more into the 3D stacking and the things that they were really building up before, and also having high-powered and low-power cores all together. That is essentially what is working so well in the M1. How do you think about Intel and how they're handling that?
So the 3D stacking thing I actually think is a little more interesting in this case if we are talking the higher performance market. The big and low powered cores, Apple has shown the advantage there in laptops, which to be honest, we've seen the advantage in phones and tablets forever. It's a little surprising people haven't tried this in laptops earlier. The idea is the low powered cores handle your mail client and background tasks, and the high powered cores do your active stuff that the programs you have foregrounded. On desktop, it's a little harder for me to see on desktop the real value of that. It may lead to some power savings, but the average, for better or worse, the average consumer is not terribly concerned about the average wattage of their desktop system.
Yeah.
But the change to stacking, there could be some really big improvements in memory access by bringing more cache or even RAM kind of directly in contact with the processor dies. You potentially have some lower power usage, improved latency, and I think that's where we could see some big advantages. I'm really curious to see how that actually gets implemented.
Gotcha. Well, I'm excited. I'm excited to see what you cover next on Upscaled, Chris. We're going to be leading into the AMD keynote right now, led by Lisa Su. So we're going to have a lot of information out of that. Chris Schodt, thank you so much for chatting about this with me. And stay tuned to Engadget for more live CES 2021 coverage. AMD's coming up next.